Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this session on the U.S. election in the wake of the last week, where a lot of us have been losing sleep and regaining it finally. Um, uh, I'm going to introduce my guests. First off, we have with us Elisabeth Clemens, who is the William Rainey Harper Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology at the University of Chicago. Uh, and doing some plugging. Her latest book is Civic Gifts. Don't know if that's the right way. Subtitled Voluntarism and the Making of the American Nation State. Um, and we also have with us Richard Lachman, who's professor of sociology at SUNY Albany, and his latest book. These are both hot off the presses. First Class Passengers on a Sinking Ship. Uh, Elite Politics and the Decline of Great Powers. I wanted to invite both Richard and Elisabeth to talk to us just because they both bring a kind of broad historical, political sociology perspective to the question of American nationalism. They're in the States, witnessing the whole thing, and it's also the case that they're not necessarily a part of the inside club of people who are part of ASEN and always working directly on nationalism. So it's nice to get a kind of a perspective on the topic that's not from, somebody who's just, immersed in it all the time. So I thought that would be nice. Just to kind of say a few things to kind of set the mood for the discussion, which will be very kind of loose. We'll talk for the three of us will talk and exchange, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and people on Facebook after an hour or so. But just to say, obviously at this point we still don't know exactly how things are going to unfold. Trump so far has not decided to stand aside. I thought, one of the things that made me think about the election of nationalism was that slogan that was on the Biden bus in the last days, fighting for the soul of the nation. That's a very kind of, a strong nation image, and it made me think, what do we mean by nation here? What is the soul of the nation? That's almost kind of classic nationalism language. I think many people on the left and the Democratic Party were kind of hoping for a strong swing and a kind of return to normality, and that didn't happen. And so we're still very much in a very polarized, society, very much a knife edge election. And I think that means that, the Biden and Harris have a lot of work cut out for them in terms of, for all Biden's talk about being a healer, that's easier said than done, And I would also just sort of say that the other thing that made me think this would be interesting to talk about is just, I've long felt that nation building is, in the literature on nationalism, often that's treated as something you do just after you form a new nation state to get it up and running, and then it chugs along, or something that powerful nations do to other nations, or try to do. But it seems to me, especially in liberal democracies, that the problem of nation building is just a constant state of affairs, because the whole political system is premised on this constant debate and contestation over what the nation is and what its agenda should be and stuff. So, I think that's elections like this are very, made to make us think about what we mean by nation building. So that's kind of the kind of setting. Okay, now I want to sort of hand over and talk to my guests. And before I, start pursuing any more specific questions, I think I'm just going to let them give me an initial response. Shall I start with Liz? Do you have a kind of initial take on what we've just been through and what we might learn from it?
I think we're not quite yet sure what we've been through, at least in its sort of complete picture. I think a lot of that picture will actually be shaped after the fact, as the meaning of the election gets reversed and engineered by what the different parties do during the interim between now and the inauguration, and the ways in which initial policy action is used to sort of cement a sense of what the election was about and how it was configured. I think for scholars, the meaning of this election is to really drive home that something that's often celebrated, having the oldest continuous democratic constitution in the world, has actually left us in a place where we're dealing with institutions that were designed in a radically different world, both in terms of the expectations of government and the way in which citizens think of themselves as individuals and people. There has been more discussion about serious institutional reform in the run-up to this election than possibly since the progressive era, which was also a moment where not only did the sense of the people transform, but there were serious institutional reforms to change the way in which the people, through democratic practices and institutions, have a say in politics and legitimate the political order. So I think there's a lot of indeterminacy in the short term, but also a real moment for reflecting on the character of these institutional legacies that have never worked perfectly. But this seems a moment where this election should make us think carefully, not only about the flaws, but also about this is an opportunity for reinvention. So, Richard.
Yes, Richard.
Okay, the good news is that Biden managed to get 10 million more votes than Clinton had 4 years ago. The bad news is that Trump got 8 million more votes than he did 4 years ago, and more than 4 million of those came from his rising percentage of non-white voters. He went from 21 to 25%, it appears. So, there is a huge constituency for Trump and Trumpism, but I think, it's been very easy for us over the past 4 years to have the focus mainly on Trump, since he was, such a bizarre and norm-breaking personality. But much of what he's done, both in policy and also in his approach to elections, is built on what the Republicans have been doing for a number of decades. And, as many people have remarked, they recognize that they don't command majority support, and the only way to remain in power is to exploit the sorts of advantages that are built into the US constitutional system. And so the interest in reforming that is vital. It's not just that we have a creaky system, but, as Liz pointed out, similarly in the progressive era, the progressives were interested in institutional reform, not just for itself, but as a way to create a political reality that would allow substantive reforms to be carried forward. And the same thing is true now. The most depressing outcome of the election is that it appears likely that the Republicans will retain control of the Senate, and the Democrats' margin in the House is much narrower. And so most of the reforms have been talked about just can't be instituted. And so then 2 years from now, the Democrats are going to go into the midterm elections with probably a very slender record of accomplishment. And, that's likely to lead to more reverses. And, so then Biden, more likely than not, is going to be following the path of Obama and Clinton, where, very quickly he wasn't able to have control over Congress. In the case of Obama and Clinton, it took 2 years. In the case of Biden, it seems it's going to take 0 years. And so it's going to be a presidency that can only operate through administrative means. And, that will only be, reversed if Biden has, some amazing good luck. I mean, perhaps if there's a workable vaccine quickly, there'll be an economic boom by 2022, and the Democrats will benefit from that. And of course, the other factor is the degree of non-electoral mobilization. That in the previous waves of reform in the 60s and 30s, that was essential to what Johnson and Roosevelt were able to push through. And, so another wave of mobilization could empower Biden and, push him in a progressive direction in a way that won't happen otherwise.
Okay. You both have mentioned, institutional reform. And obviously the biggie there is the Electoral College, which we know is very difficult to affect, especially if you don't control the Senate by some massive amount. Are there other things that you guys had in mind besides that? You've sort of suggested a more kind of popular movement. There are issues about control of local government and state government to deal with gerrymandering issues. But are you, do you have anything hopeful to say about this institutional reform agenda?
Well, I think it's important that it's on the agenda and that people are talking about it. And, as Liz pointed out, in a way that they haven't for over 100 years. And, the Constitution is designed to make it very difficult to amend. And, so with the Electoral College, there's this electoral compact where a number of states have passed legislation saying they'll award their electoral votes to whoever gets majority of the popular vote as soon as enough states that have 270 electoral votes, a majority agree to that. And, they're not yet there, but certainly feasible to imagine that happening. And, that would certainly make a crucial difference. The other key reform would be to abolish or in some way alter the Senate, where, there's these enormous population differences, so that, there are only 8 states that have a bigger population than Los Angeles County. So, you can have these small rural states that are overwhelmingly Republican dominating the Senate. And, it's very, unless there's some, constitutional change, that's not going to be reversed. As for the Supreme Court, in fact, Congress does have the power not just to add more justices, but also to limit the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. And that's, something that's been proposed in the past, during the Civil Rights era. Southern states proposed that. During the Cold War era, there were various, proposals to limit Supreme Court jurisdiction in national security areas and freedom of speech. None of those passed, but it's, if there was a moment when the Democrats dominated Congress, I could certainly, imagine that happening.
Elizabeth, do you want to?
Yeah, I think the institutional reforms are difficult, tremendously challenging, and the significance of this election is to have really started a conversation about issues that often seem arcane. I think there are opportunities that will be open to the incoming administration, less in terms of institutional reform, but more with respect to the practices of governing that can strengthen a sense of government as a source of actions that actually benefit people's lives. I think one of the great disjunctures between how we in the academy talk about voting and what voters report is, it's easy to start off with a basic model of pocketbook politics. Individuals have interests, they sort of look at what the two parties are offering, they pick the party that maximizes their interests. But the way government is built, and particularly American government is built, it is almost impossible to answer the question of what are your tax dollars doing for you, right? We have a governing apparatus that defeats the kind of voter rationality that's often the bedrock of academic analyses. And there are things that an administration can do to make it very clear that the government is doing this for you, and to try and inject some more rationality into the discussion. Trump did some of these beautifully. he held out and insisted on signing those stimulus checks personally, right? And that probably made a difference. When extra food boxes went out to food banks, there were letters from Trump in them that in some places, blue places, were removed by the volunteers of the food banks before the boxes got distributed. But in other places, it's, you know, back to good old 19th century patronage politics, where your alderman provides you with a turkey for Thanksgiving or Christmas. There are versions of that that clarify the relationship between what government does and how people understand their relationship to those practices that I think can be strengthened. The Obama administration was very enamored of behavioral economics and the theory of the nudge, because the economists said this will be the way in which stimulus will be spent rather than saved. And that seems to have been true economically, but the political cost was that people didn't credit the Obama administration for that extra money in their pocket. So I think one piece of this reverse engineering of what the election means will be that the incoming administration needs to be very clear about what it is doing to sort of provide benefits, and I think shamelessly take credit if the vaccine actually is effective. I mean, I think that is the opportunity to go into 2022 with a big win, that your kids are in school again, the softball leagues are functioning again, you're shopping and going on vacation again. Take credit shamelessly.
Yeah. But I take it, you know, take credit also in my terms is it's a kind of nation building. It's a kind of saying,
Yes.
you know, we're you know, this is something we're doing for each other, as it were. Yeah.
There's a lovely essay that Des King and Patrick Le Gallais had in a special issue of the British Journal of Sociology, reflecting on the Great Recession. And I won't get the phrase quite right, but it's something about the unifying energy of the state, right? That the practices and experience of mobilizing together to address and hopefully resolve a problem can be enormously effective as a source of political solidarity.
And this also can create a virtuous cycle that people vote for Democrats and they don't see what they get. But you know, if the Democrats say, we've done this because you elected us in, then people feel, wow, if we vote for them again, we're going to get something else. And you know, if that's then combined with government can be effective when you get people who are committed to government and are competent, we can deliver these things, unlike, you know, Trump, who appointed obvious buffoons and grifters to so many of the governmental positions. It can make this contrast clearer.
So, I mean, a lot of people on the Democratic left, you know, lamented the question, how do we get back to the New Deal and the FDR? How do we return to that view of things? And part of what we're sort of saying here is that in some ways the Republicans managed to so completely change the script that Democrats have sort of bought into it and said, well, we can't convince people that the state is something that, you know, does good for them. Can I shift this a bit to back to this kind of, you know, national populist moment? I mean, you both referred to the earlier period of populism around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, but you know, it's a rather curious moment in that there is definitely a kind of populist movement on both the left and the right, and probably the more further wings of the left and the right. But the question is how oriented is that towards this more civic and in some ways, you know, to be oriented to the state and what it can achieve institutionally is always a bit more centrist in some sense. I mean, do you have it seems to me it's hard to do this nation building language in such a polarized populist atmosphere, despite the fact that there's populist energies out there.
Mhm.
Any uh, thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the absences from this election campaign that does concern me is the relatively uh, light emphasis on specific policies in favor of, particularly in the last month or so, a discussion about, character, and sort of the Biden campaign um, making its case on the base of empathy. That doesn't provide much traction in terms of sort of shaping expectations for what government should do. What I'm interested to learn more about is what comes out of these 6 or 8 committees that were set up, drawing on people from both the Biden and the Sanders campaign to come up with short-term agendas that might finesse the gap between this is as far as we can go for the moderate Democrats, and this is a meaningful first step for the more sort of left progressive wing of the party. And if that was a productive exercise, and I don't think we really know yet, that could actually go a long way towards energizing a sense of common project, at least among Democrats. And I think that has to be a first step, even before you think about what might mute the divide between Democrats and Republicans, which I think is tremendously deep and deepened by the political process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of having proposals that are very clear and easy to understand and offer universal benefits that, while Obamacare was a significant reform, it was such a complex program that, many people didn't see what they got from it. And the things that were clear in it, like children can remain on their parents' insurance policy until they're age 26. Insurance companies can't disqualify you or charge you more because you have a pre-existing medical condition, are enormously popular. And the other aspects that for understandable reasons were engineered in very complex ways to get it through Congress, to meet certain budgetary limits, to allow private insurance companies to continue to operate, have been masked the benefits and made it less popular. So, that was part of Sanders' appeal, that his proposals were very clear. Everybody gets to go to college for free. There's a $15 minimum wage. Everybody can get health care without cost through the national government. And of course, that would create, one of the ways you create a sense of national belonging is if people feel, because I'm a citizen or resident of this country, I'm entitled to all sorts of things. Being an American means I have a secure old age, or I get health care, or my children get daycare in the way that operates in many other countries. And that's a much better focus than we Americans are nice people, or we're inclusive. That's very vague, and people, that doesn't give people a sense of national belonging.
Wear a mask is good advice, but not much of a slogan. Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Although yesterday,
go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, Liz, you were saying?
You were saying?
the governor of Utah issued a mask mandate yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So post-election, we may see that change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know if I mean, there's this one thesis about that the nation's in a mood for electing outsiders and Sanders could have done as well as Biden. I'm skeptical about that. I don't know if that was the upshot of what you were saying, uh, Richard, but um, it's one thing to say he had a clear agenda. It's another to say that would have worked as a campaign.
I mean, I certainly don't know, but one lesson is even when you nominate the moderate, they're called a socialist. That this is
Yeah.
people spend all their time in Washington in government or politics and are very aware of these specific points in policy, think that when they make a compromise that looks like a compromise to them, that the general public that doesn't pay very much attention will also say, oh yes, Obama isn't a socialist. Look at Obamacare, there's private insurance and this and that. But most people don't follow things that closely. And so it's very easy to convince them, if they're Democrats, that means that they want to take your money and give it to Black people. So, that's what socialism is. Or, if they're Democrats, that means they want to get rid of the police so that you can have your property taken. And, it obviously doesn't work with everyone. The Democrats get more votes, but, you don't counter that by, doing these very complex calculations. You do it by establishing a different identity and saying, no, what being a Democrat means is, everybody has a right to these things. And, these aren't programs that are given out on the basis of race or ethnicity or other complex formulas.
Yeah. Sorry, Elizabeth, were you about to say something? Or
Well, Richard actually, I think, made the key point that I think those of us in academia often sort of dismiss this fear of socialism as just unfounded, but certainly I've had conversations around pickup trucks in rural Arizona where it's like, the kids, they don't want the Soviet Union, they want Denmark. And the way in which the sort of right wing of the media portrays it, it's like just one small step from voting to Biden to the Soviet Union. And these are conversations with intelligent, worldly, educated people. And I think this is a place where there's some limits of understanding on the part of those of us who live in, a particular kind of urban, well, I would say coastal, except I'm in Chicago, we're the third coast. So, but that we actually underestimate the force of that reaction.
do either of you have a sense? I mean, I know that sometimes, when I was, watching that discourse play out, and obviously, it was majored on in Florida for very strategic reasons and stuff. But I remember, probably much of my life, I sort of thought after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, you sort of thought that extreme American paranoia about all that was going to kind of fade and go out of focus. But I just don't. I ask myself, has it been there all along, ready to tap into, or has it been somehow revivified in recent years? I mean, that may be an imponderable question, but it seems to hark back to a kind of 1950s, paranoia about Russia or something.
I mean, I don't know how much of it's focused on Russia or the Soviet Union. And, obviously, most people who vote Republican don't do it for that basis. But certainly in Florida, the Cuban and Venezuelan immigrants, when they heard socialism, they had an example in front of their eyes that was, enormously compelling. And, if you keep hammering at that, it doesn't have to be connected really to anything. I mean, it can, it's in part connected to China. And, while China isn't really a socialist country, it's, it's images of country that's regimented, that has a government that tells people what to do. So it's, certainly an unpleasant sort of image, and one that can be exploited.
Mm.
I think the significance of 1989 is that it took what had been a kind of cross-cutting cleavage in American politics, where you had cold warriors in both parties, and sort of pulled that pin out so that the Cold Warrior position is now almost fully mapping on to the Republican Party. And so it intensifies the way, sort of differences along different dimensions, whereas 20, 30 years ago, it cross-cut them.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost a little bit of that. My internet connection went out for a minute. Can I bring us back to this, this question of what is the polarization in the nation all about? I mean, when people try and understand it, you get all these different divisions between, urban and rural. Rural isn't really the right word for it, but um, young and old, race, class, levels of education. All these things are kind of mobilized, and they obviously are all together create a picture, but there's so many exceptions to it as well. And as Richard was saying earlier, the ethnic vote went up for Trump this time, and so do we know what that division is really all about at this stage? I mean, what of those are the most crucial factors?
I mean, a lot of it, the urban-rural divide, seems to explain a lot. Partly it's a matter, also of education, which, overlaps with that greatly, that people with educations, for the most part, don't want to remain in rural areas. They move to cities. Cities are more heavily non-white than rural areas, although, there are all sorts of rural areas that, now are heavily populated by immigrants. And, the great achievement, I don't know if achievement's the right word, but, the Republicans' success has been to, focus resentment, away from capitalists who, still, are more likely to support Republicans and Democrats, and instead say, the people who are exploiting you are these, snotty professors and, people who are talking about racism and white privilege all the time. And, that's a very effective claim to make. And, to many people, that makes sense. And, it's partly also from people's experience. Most people in America, never, really meet a capitalist. The only, genuinely rich, because he's not genuinely rich, the only person they see is, Donald Trump on The Apprentice. That's what they think rich people are, sort of brash, daring, creative, and, they don't see what most capitalists do, but, they all, encounter some well-educated people who, people who have bookstores and, all these things that can be fed on. And of course, that gets into the news. And when you have, a movement like Black Lives Matter, the people who journalists decide to put on TV are, as always, the most provocative ones who, will say things that, rural, less educated whites, take as challenges and affronts to them. And, they're not entirely wrong about that.
So I'll indulge in one of my favorite grumps, which is that I don't think the right way to approach the question is to ask which factor really matters. the debates over, is it really race or is it really class, strike me as really taking us down a dead end. It's an interaction, and it's an interaction that is intensified and conditioned on differences of education and urban-rural. And all of those are profoundly at play in building very increasingly homogeneous social worlds on both sides of that partisan divide. The other thing I'll add is that the traditional way of thinking about class analysis leads us to focus on, sort of workers and the most disadvantaged and the capitalists. And I think the action in American politics for a long, long time, but particularly now, is actually in the middle. That the shifts are around the sort of self-employed small business who really did get hit by Obamacare because they were required to buy insurance, but they made too much to get any subsidy. And then folks like us who are employees of large organizations, but in pretty cushy conditions. And much of where the dynamism in American politics is in those groups that in a classic class analysis are either relegated to, irrelevance, something of the past, the petite bourgeoisie, or who are in contradictory class locations, to invoke Eric Olin Wright, among others. So the language of left and right, I think, misses where much of the dynamism and intensity of American politics is right now.
Yeah, no, I echo your sentiments.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, both. I mean, both at the it's not race or class, but also, I mean, if I can push a little bit further on the education thing, that it does. I mean, from the classic literature like Eugen Weber's Peasants into Frenchmen and
Mm-hmm.
Ernest Gellner, the common sense was always schooling and education helped build a nation together. But I have the strong sense that, for the, some of the kind of credentialist reasons that Randall Collins, often emphasized, that,
Yeah.
that it's now becoming a kind of marker of who's in and who's out, or who's left behind. And so, especially higher education is now a divisive, a nation dividing factor rather than a nation building factor.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's something. So that and part of the contradiction of Trump when he's supposedly a successful businessman, but his habitus, his demeanor is, it's not like us. It's not like us, civilized professionals. It's got this really rough quality that distances him from that, image. Mm-hmm. Or whatever. So I don't know. It makes me worry about the places we work and what these places are doing, and what and I mean, there's a lot of scope for talk about, well, just trying to get everybody into higher education, is that necessarily the best strategy for making the country and the economy work? I don't know what you think. Mm-hmm. About that. And does it have knock-on issues having to do with this kind of divisive quality in the society?
And politically, we do want to get everybody into higher education because there's ample evidence that when people go through university, they're more tolerant, further on the left, so, that's good. Whether, economically, if everybody has university education, they're not magically going to be enough jobs for all those people. And, there are ample historical and contemporary cases where you have people who are educated and don't get the jobs they think they deserve, and it makes them very angry and perhaps pushes them to the right. And also economically, it doesn't solve problems. In the U.S., there's a huge demand for people who are trained in in trades and craft jobs, and there aren't the mechanisms to accomplish that. And meanwhile, people are funneled through universities and then get degrees and don't get the sorts of jobs that justify that investment. So economically, we might not want to funnel everybody through university, but we do have real influence over our students, and we mold them in a way that lasts them the rest of their lives. And I don't want to give that up.
What I'd add to that is certainly echo Richard's points about the virtues of higher education, but also suggest that one of the real policy challenges is to think more about how to make that sort of transition and passage through some kind of post-secondary education more equitable, and for many, many people, more effective and less predatory. If you can get admitted to a place like the place I teach, there's a lot of financial aid. You come out with less debt than you do if you're going to a culinary school, right? But people who are looking for that sort of training that will get them into a good job either face really predatory possibilities in the for-profit college sector, or they're looking at union apprenticeship positions, which are one of the relatively few remaining ways that the working class has to basically pass on advantage to the next generation, and so are pressure points for the retention of ethnic advantage. So outside of sort of liberal arts higher education, the current terrain is one that's really treacherous and predatory and hostile to people who are trying to figure out how do you make a path from high school to a job that will let you not even buy a house, but have a security deposit and a next month's rent on an apartment and be able to think about forming a family. That's an area I think that intensifies the sense of disadvantage and unfairness and is just ripe for good policy intervention.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I agree with Richard. It's nice to have a bully pulpit to convert young people to our point of view. But one also has a sense that, to some degree, in recent decades, the promotion of higher education, it's been a kind of band-aid, a sticking plaster, as we say over here, to avoid talking about the issue of actually creating jobs. Especially once capital and labor are much more mobile, and
Right.
kind of local industry is weakened, and there's something, I mean, for me, a bit cart before the horse of only emphasizing education and not attaching that to an agenda about work, because I think that's just as people often say that one of the things that brings people together is just across divides is just the chance to interact. Well, one of the best places to do that is at work, and increasingly a lot of work isolates people, doesn't bring them together, and people don't have enough work. I mean, I know the narrative of late is that that's improved in the U.S. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what you think, whether it improved that much during Trump's tenure, or whether that was just a continuation of the recovery that Obama started. But
well, I think just to sort of tag on to that, where we started was a sense of a democracy where institutional reform has come to the forefront as we recognize many of the limitations of the institutional order. That's coming at the same time where we have large cohorts of young people who we know from the research are going to be damaged across the life course, from the timing of first the Great Recession and then the pandemic. Their lifetime earnings are going to be lower. It's going to be, given the demographics of our audience, I apologize for saying this. My sister says don't get too gloomy on the family Zooms because it upsets the kids. But that's also a place where I think attention needs to be directed immediately. How, there are all kinds of things that need to be done. There are all kinds of public goods that need to be produced. And that would be a way to do stimulus spending in a targeted way to help those who are just leaving school, just entering the labor market, get their feet under them and undo some of the damage of these systemic shocks of epidemic and recession.
And that's something Biden can do unilaterally.
Yes.
He could forgive all the, government guaranteed student debt, which is now approaching $2 trillion. It would mean that people in those cohorts, suddenly would have hundreds of extra dollars each month, or in some cases thousands, that wouldn't go to paying off these loans. And, it would be, wow, we elected a Democrat and look what they did for us immediately. So it would, make sense economically and politically.
My sense is that the Green New Deal agenda it's kind of occupying this space of doing something, but it's not really developed or elaborated at this point in terms of what it means.
Well, I mean, it won't get through Congress, even if the Democrats narrowly take the Senate. There are, several Democratic senators who come from states that with economies based in fossil fuels and would oppose that. I mean, it'll partly go in that there'll be changes in regulation and, just that technology is developing so that green energy now is genuinely cheaper than fossil fuels. And if, Biden, does have authority to withhold all sorts of federal subsidies for fossil fuels, as Obama did. I mean, Obama was able to wipe out much of the coal industry, and I think Biden will be able to do the rest and also take part of the oil industry without any intervention by Congress.
But I also think, sort of in the spirit of one piece of the New Deal, the National Youth Administration, you could envision money going into wetlands restorations projects that would overwhelmingly hire young people and provide a modicum of training that might lead to careers in environmental engineering, landscaping, who knows, but sort of ways of intervening quickly to produce visible public goods, but to also provide meaningful work and experience for a year or two or three as we hope the economic system recovers from the shock.
I mean, we've sort of moved to talking a bit about the prospects for young people, and one of the theses for the Democratic Party and the left has been demographically the country is heading our direction. Trump and the far right got lucky at a certain juncture, but the longer we go, the more a kind of whole younger generation with a socialized to a different set of values and stuff and exposed to us in universities will move in the direction of the Democratic Party. I mean, do you have that kind of demographic hope, or do you have doubts about that?
I mean, we've been hearing this, for decades. I mean, there's a sociologist, Rui Teixeira, who's made his entire career making that argument, and it's always about to happen. And I mean, I think there are two aspects, the view that as the non-white voting population goes up, it's going to move the country to the left, hasn't quite worked out as was expected. And certainly Trump's ability to increase his share of the non-white vote argues against that. And, it's certainly clear that, non-whites don't all see themselves as people of color, that there's all sorts of antagonisms. People who, came and immigrated legally have resentment against people who immigrated in an undocumented way. Latinos don't necessarily like Blacks, Asians, don't necessarily like Latinos or Black. There are, all these sorts of antagonisms. I think the change that is real is that younger people, have much more progressive views on social issues, so that, things like abortion and those related issues are going to have become less and less compelling. And, for that, we do just have to wait. In every election, there are millions of people with reactionary views on social issues who die, and they're replaced by young people with very different views. And even, among evangelicals, the younger ones don't have this focus on abortion that the older ones do. So, that is a real transformation. But it's also one the Republicans, to some extent, can respond to. They don't have to talk about those social issues as much. They can become adaptable. And, certainly, the huge transformation in the sorts of issues Republicans have talked about since Trump gained dominance is a sign that parties can shift quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let me follow on Richard's comment in sort of both pieces to just draw out a specific issue. Part of the, the sort of demographic destiny of the Democratic Party in terms of people of color, part of the problem with that is it neglected to notice that the upward mobility path for particularly immigrants, second generation immigrants, is into the small business sector that pulls them rightward. So given that, I think we want to seriously think about the sort of possible trajectories for younger voters who are particularly among people of color, more oriented towards the Democratic Party, more progressive in terms of social values, particularly around gender identity, sexuality broadly. But I think also very vulnerable to disillusionment, right? And so I think it would be a mistake for Democrats to assume that, oh, we got 50% of the youth vote turning out this time, overwhelmingly Democratic, got those in the bag. The possibilities of the trajectories that might develop out of this election if the Democrats do nothing concrete to improve the really dire situation that many of that cohort find themselves in. Those trajectories are not ones that are happy, but ones that are familiar to anyone who has done much comparative and historical work on politics of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Let me just try and sort of bring our discussion a bit to a close by asking you each a kind of question a little bit more directly connected to your own work. I mean, the book, Civic Gifts, your book, Elisabeth, is about the role of philanthropy and civil society in nation building in some sense, and about the kind of puzzles of a society that believes in individualism and autonomy, and how does it deal with charity as a way of creating social solidarity when there's a kind of resistance to that as a principle of social interaction or whatever. But do you have a sense of a role for philanthropy, the charitable giving, however you want to put that, in the present moment in terms of some of these kind of reunifying the nation kind of
Mhm.
questions?
Well, let me use the pandemic to think with in this case. In March and April, it felt like, wow, we were back in the early 20th century. People were getting out their sewing machines, they were making masks, they were setting up impromptu food banks, and these sort of practices of local voluntarism and less charity than sort of mutuality and reciprocity, with, you know, everyone looking in their woodshed to see, is there a mask or two, even though they were the wrong kinds of masks for medical professionals. Still, people were looking in their woodsheds and saying, can I contribute something to the local hospital? Um, so that suggested that in a very sort of thinned out and eroded way, a model for a not entirely, you know, not perfect, but admirable in some ways alternative to a classic redistributive welfare state is still viable. And there's kind of a muscle memory about that kind of self-provisioning, at least in moments of crisis. And it's one that allows for variations between regions, and that may be important. Some have argued that there's a kind of trade-off between a progressivism that is based on nationally uniform rights and one that sort of allows different places to take different paths. And the shortcoming of that latter path is you may have gender non-specific bathrooms in San Francisco, but you will not have them in North Carolina. So you give up, there's a trade-off between a room for local action and progressivism and a guarantee of national rights. So that, I think, is actually there as an alternative that had seemed, you know, utterly antique, but turns out still to be viable. A danger with that reliance on civic mutuality and private philanthropy is that it does not guarantee equality. In fact, it enables the reproduction of inequality, right? That the food boxes in one place are not the same as the food boxes in another place in terms of quantity, quality, frequency, whatever. So that in shifting to a form of governance that depends on the enactment and the production of public goods by private citizens, regardless of wealth, you're opening the world of policy broadly construed to great private influence, partly by the, you know, the local volunteers, but also by the big philanthropists and the big corporations, right? So it's a possible alternative, and the book is really about excavating how we got a workable big government without having a major state, but it's a way of doing government that has some real dangers in terms of democratic principles.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me throw one at you now, Richard. Just your book is, you know, foretelling the hegemonic decline of the United States, and then, you know, the message at the end. I don't want to, not to be a spoiler, but it's about managing decline rather than reversing decline.
The boat sinks.
Yeah.
At least we spent, you know, the rest of our lives bailing water out. But I mean, what, you know, is there an analysis of, again, this present moment and the kind of polarization that we've been talking about, and what elites have or haven't been doing in the U.S.? I mean, in that, you know, for you, elites are the major agent in all this process.
Yeah, I mean, they've, in some ways, they've done very well. I mean, the one substantive accomplishment of Trump's administration was this tax cut bill that, is weighted, way toward the top. And over the next several years, the cuts for people who aren't wealthy are going to expire, while many of the ones for the wealthy are permanent ones. And of course, the corporate tax ones are. And a third of US stocks are now owned by people outside the United States. So, a third of this lost revenue is literally leaving the country. And, I think, what does that have to do with the election and the sort of polarization? It's, in part, elites have been able to paralyze decision-making, have been able to block any sorts of programs or regulations that would undermine their privilege, would cost them money. And, so now after decades of government without most people getting any benefits, the focus in elections is, on these sorts of, non-economic issues. If you decide I'm not going to get any real programmatic benefits out of government, then why not vote on the basis of preserving or abolishing abortion rights? Or, why not vote on because, I hate, these well-educated people in cities and Trump drives them crazy, so I'm going to vote for Trump. So that's one thing I can get out of government. I can, watch these people I hate have to squirm for another 4 years. But, that's not a sort of politics that is going to lead in a good direction or build up government capacity or a sense of national identity. And reversing that is, going to require, either a string of, enormous skill and luck on the part of the Democratic Party, or, as I mentioned at the beginning, some sort of mobilization from outside the electoral arena that, places pressure. And, we've seen, some signs of that. Probably the most hopeful one in the last couple of years have been these, so-called red state teacher strikes. We have teachers in Republican states, going on strike and getting these, right-wing legislatures and governors to give into their demands, raise taxes so that there's more money for schools. And it wasn't just a case of the teachers saying, we want to earn more. They also were going on strike to, get money to provide more benefits, for the students, to have nurses and social workers in the schools. And then, wherever these strikes have happened, they've been successful, not just in the red states, but, also a couple of years ago in Chicago, where you had the mayor was this guy, Rahm Emanuel, who'd been Obama's first chief of staff and then left to, try to, grind Chicago even further into the dust of neoliberalism.
See Elizabeth there dusting herself off. Okay, well, let me try and turn to some of the questions that are being forwarded to me from the chat line. And so I have a chance to scan them. I'm just going to start with one that's very short. And it's from Alice. And the entire question is just one word: gender. So I think, what's the gender angle here? We haven't discussed that. Either of you want to respond to that?
So I want to expand it first to sort of gender and sexuality.
Okay.
The arguments about gender identity and sexuality are clearly deeply important in the mobilization of sort of youth and their sort of opposition to the deep opposition to many forms of social conservatism that was evident in protests really since the first Women's March. I mean, that has, I think, become a central component. But that's not quite the same as how do people who identify with different genders vote. And this election is actually confounded expectations a little. There was a great expectation that suburban women would swing towards the Democratic Party. The polling and the vote analysis is still really preliminary, but there's a sense that even though many individuals out of that demographic were mobilized as part of the resistance and indivisible and all of this, that there doesn't seem to have been that sort of bit of a realignment around quite conservative ideas of femininity, around protecting the family in times of pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So my sense is at this moment that the sort of commitments around gender identity and all its many forms that people as old as me can't possibly keep up with is much more potent than this expectation that there would be a sort of mothers of mobilization within the electorate. But I haven't actually, so I haven't seen definitive data yet on how that played out.
Do you have anything to add there, Richard? Or?
No, I mean, I agree that, once we have the analysis of, the vote, we'll have a clear idea, but, certainly, gender has mattered, both that the opposition to Trump, as Liz pointed out, really began with the Women's March, and women have, provided the force for much of that, and that also that gender issues are enormously resonant, on both sides.
And I just to sort of add, I think the pandemic sets up an opportunity that may or may not be exploited by some policy entrepreneur. So many women with children have left the workforce, have sort of felt the just irresolvable challenges of working and raising children at the same time, that there's a sort of potential to mobilize that group in the interests of pushing some of the absent pieces of American social provision around early childhood education, and other kinds of family related issues. So that is there, I think, in a more potent way, but very much something that would need to be seized in the upcoming electoral cycles.
Let me, David, the man behind the curtain who's making the show work, is giving us a news feed. Apparently, Secretary Pompeo has just said that there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. So they're in another universe over there. But let me ask another question, and this one's from Andy. Says kind of a strategic question. What about DC and Puerto Rico would making them states counterbalance the advantages that the Electoral College and gerrymandering pose for the GOP? Does that seem like a viable strategy?
Yeah, no, I mean, that would add 4 Democratic seats in the Senate, and I mean, if the Republicans control the Senate, they, it's not going to get through. But I think, again, this is something that activists in the Democratic Party need to keep hammering at, so that when the Democrats are in a majority, that they will do that, and there won't be this sort of reluctance of, oh, the Republicans might be angry, or this looks like it's too aggressive. And more broadly, there needs to be a continual effort by Democrats to point out that the Republicans aren't playing by the old rules. That, these old rules are gone. That, maybe there can be a return, on a rhetorical level to comity, but, in terms of, the actual policies and strategies of Republicans, they're not going back. They're not going to cooperate, and the Democrats, need to repeat that again and again, so that when they adopt strategies to counter that, those will be seen as legitimate, or at least not more illegitimate than what the Republicans are doing.
I'd just add that from what I've read, DC would be reliably two Democratic senators, Puerto Rico more purple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But the point
be.
about the, the lack of representation stands nonetheless, and the importance of pointing that out.
It's another question. This one's from Noah. Says local media in the U.S. has greatly declined, with lots of local newspapers closed. Is part of the problem that people in the U.S. are having to negotiate a new imagined community on a countrywide scale? And
Yes.
Go ahead, Liz.
Go ahead, Richard.
yeah. I mean, it's that, but it's also that, because of that, people don't have much information about their representatives. I mean, in the US system, senators and members of Congress are elected from localities. So, the main way people find out what their senator representative is doing is from local news outlets. And, both the disappearance of so many newspapers and also the absorption of local radio and television stations into these national networks means that nobody knows what their representatives are doing. And Democrats haven't been very good at hammering at that. I mean, you have these Senate races where the Democrats have had tens of millions of dollars, and they just frittered it away on these general ads, when I think it would have been much more effective if they instead had ads saying, you should be aware that your Republican senator or your Republican representative voted to give money to this special interest, or they voted to eliminate this regulation that makes this specific workplace in your district more dangerous, or let these jobs disappear. And so I mean, certainly one reform the Democrats should try to push is to use antitrust to break up these large national networks, to return these regulations from the Federal Communication Commission that required equal representation, the fairness doctrine, which meant if you put on a right-wing viewpoint, you had to spend an equal amount of time on a left-wing viewpoint. I mean, if that were reinstituted, that would be the end of Fox. And Sinclair, they couldn't operate as these ideological networks. And that's something that if the Democrats can do, because the majority, the president's party gets 3 seats on the Federal Communication Commission, the other gets 2. So they could, that's something they could do. But the Democrats haven't been very good at pointing people to these regulatory bodies that have a real commitment to imposing stricter regulation on corporations. I mean, this is now going to be the 3rd Democratic administration that talks about appointees in terms of, we want a cabinet that looks like the United States. And of course, what they mean is that they're Blacks and Latinos and Asians and women. But, to many people in America, they may look different, but, they all went to the Ivy League. They all, worked for corporate law firms, and they're all doing corporate interests. And, we'll see if, the influence of Sanders and Elizabeth Warren gets Biden to appoint different sorts of people who are going to crack down more heavily. And certainly with Federal Communication Commission, this is a matter of the Democratic Party's electoral success, and you'd hope that Biden would see that.
Elizabeth, did you want to come in there at all? Or?
Well, here is actually a place where thinking creatively about nonprofit forms can make a real difference. We've seen the influence of operations like ProPublica, which has partnered with different kinds of local news to do really important investigative journalism. Here in Chicago, what did you call us? The Dust Bowl of neoliberalism. The long-standing
Just that.
alternative paper has reconstituted itself as a nonprofit. And given that papers are no longer paper, they're no longer material in that sense, I think there is an opportunity to revive a kind of lively local press that's nonprofit, draws on a lot of voluntarism, but might actually help to rebuild a sense of localism. And this is someplace where I think institutional inventiveness could play an enormous role in sort of stepping in and saying, a turn back to the great newspapers is not the promising venue, but there are different local forms that might address this felt need.
Yeah, I think, that's definitely the case, and ProPublica has played a wonderful role. And, this is, there, are, foundations and philanthropists who, have progressive instincts, and, they could, be encouraged, it could be explained to them that, this is perhaps the best investment of their money if they want to have an effect on there's, for decades been this huge divide where, the right has been very smart at, spending their philanthropic money on building right-wing think tanks and publications, while, on the left it's, oh, this is horrible, they've restricted abortion, so, we're not going to spend our money fighting politically, we're, going to donate money so that 200 women can afford to get an abortion. And that's an admirable thing to do, but that's not, moving the politics of the country.
Yeah. Well, let me ask another question. This is from Gazin. A pretty heavy one here. Given various anomalies in the American system, such as gerrymandering, continued voter suppression, politicization of the judiciary, and increasing stalemates between the White House and Congress, does the US still qualify as a liberal democracy? In many ways, these are features of a failed state in the making. Do we stop calling the US a liberal democracy, or do we redefine the concept of liberal democracy? I don't know. That sounds like it's a bit on your bailiwick, Richard.
Yeah, but I think it's, to be determined. That, the United States definitely is moving away from being a liberal democracy, and certainly the Republican strategy is to make it hard for people who are unlikely to vote for them to be able to vote, and beyond that, to make politics so disgusting and unproductive that people become disillusioned and don't vote. But I think the one good thing that came out of Trump is that it's mobilized many people, and to have mainstream Democrats saying we're in a struggle to preserve democracy is, it's horrible that democracy is under danger, but it's good that there's a recognition that it's under danger. My worry is, once Trump disappears, that people are going to relax, and the next Republican candidate is going to be somebody who's toilet trained and acts in a polite way, and won't create this sense of emergency and this long-term strategy of suppressing the vote, gerrymandering, and all these other techniques will continue, and so the U.S. will end up moving further away from liberal democracy.
So that would be a Republican candidate who comes with his big boy pants as opposed to.
Yeah, that, and, most of them, manage to do that.
Mhm.
Elizabeth, did you?
Yeah, I would maybe put to be determined in a stronger sense that that is exactly the issue of the coming elections. I think the consequence of 2016 until now is to clarify the stakes in the election. I think a big piece of the really stunning increases in turnout this year is that those stakes became clear to a great many people. They may not have understood it in terms of democracy or authoritarianism, but certainly that these are elections that are sort of shaping what will be labeled democracy. We're not going to give up the label. We're going to call it liberal democracy, whatever the pundits say, because that's what American political culture does. But I think it certainly means that scholars and political strategists have to take seriously the path traced by countries like Hungary. There are actually a lot of parallels between the sort of specific practices and opportunities that sort of facilitated that move towards authoritarianism in Hungary, and the opportunities that are afforded by the American political system. And I think we need to think seriously, carefully, and avoid overly optimistic idealism. It's a fight that can be won, but it's a fight that's going to have to be fought.
Okay, I've got one more question here, and then I think we'll be time to wind up here. And this is so using France as a comparison. Pugilism only went away in France with the shift from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic. Even so, it or something like it, similar to it, still exists in France. Will it require something as large as a major change in the US constitutional settlement to make Trumpism go away, even if Trump himself is gone?
I mean, it requires something major. I mean, if, we could magically rewrite the Constitution if there was direct election of the president, the abolition of the Senate, restrictions on the Supreme Court, putting a new amendment that puts, voting rights, as, a genuine right, which would, eliminate, these sorts of restrictions, a ban on gerrymandering. We could make a whole list. That would certainly be a major transformation. I mean, as Trump said, talking, I forget which one of those he talked about, he said, if we had this, there'd never be a Republican elected in this country again. And, so we had that, there wouldn't be a Republican elected, or the Republican Party to survive would have to drastically transform itself. But, that's not the only way to save democracy. If, there can be a focus on substantive issues, and there can be a level of mobilization where people, make a demand and they can force both parties to respond to that, or, will vote the Democrats, into majority, on a clear platform of we're going to, provide these things, and then the Democrats do that. In itself would so transform politics. And I mean, after all, we were able to get the reforms of the 30s and 60s with this political system. So there could be another wave of reforms without constitutional changes.
So the great French organizational sociologist Michel Crozier made a case at the end of his book on the French bureaucracy that the thing to be explained is the trajectory of change. And so the thing to understand about France is why change takes the form of successive refoundings, you know, what, 5 republics, a couple of empires, whereas across that same time, yeah, the United States has had one constitution with a bunch of amendments and a bunch of procedural reforms. I, like Richard, suspect that if there is a significant reconfiguration, it's going to happen through some set of reforms within the system rather than opening up the whole Constitution and writing a new one. But it's really still pretty fresh in a lot of people's minds how much is not working about the current system. And so those reforms of the progressive era were developed, that set of demands, over 20 years, really starting with the populists, like how do we make the system more democratic? And strikingly, we're just at the beginning of that, I think, because a lot of policy elites have assumed that just getting the right technocrats in office will solve all the problems. And so the idea that you need to think seriously about the reform of democratic practices and institutions is kind of something a lot of people are just waking up to. Certainly not all people. A lot of people have been very aware of gerrymandering, voter suppression, and have made significant progress. Arizona is now 15 or 20 years into nonpartisan redistricting, right? So that's an earlier reform that changes the polity in a way that contributes to the flip now. So I don't think it'll be a massive shock. The question is, will we be able to cobble together enough reforms to re-legitimate the system?
Good. I think we're coming to a close. I'll just say that this last question on France and our wrestling with prognostication about the future reminds me of it's probably an apocryphal story that goes around here at the University of Edinburgh. But it used to be that they would write up exam questions months in advance, and then they would go locked into a drawer. And then in June, the students would sit in their chairs and open the paper and find out what the question was. And apparently in June 1968, a whole bunch of politics students opened up their papers to see that it said, "Why is the Fifth French Republic so stable?" So, who knows? But there's
Who
been
knows?
a nice combination of hope and skepticism. I think what we've covered tonight. Um, I think at that point, I think I will just sort of say thank you to both, to Elisabeth and to Richard, for having so many interesting things to say. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.